Hi, folks, and welcome to the second episode of Atom or A Touch of Multiplatform. Today we have two amazing guests from CashApp that almost need no introduction, but for the sake of completeness, we are going to make them introduce themselves anyway. So let's start with just a brief round of introductions. I'll start since I'm kind of new on the scene. My name is Pamela, and I'm a developer advocate at JetBrains for Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile. I'll be hosting today's episode together with my co-host, Justin. Justin, will you go next, please?
Yes, welcome everybody. I work at Touchlab, partnering with JetBrains on A Touch of Multiplatform. It's been great working with JetBrains, and I'm so happy to have Jake and Jesse here from Square/Block/CashApp. How do you introduce yourself these days? Let's start with Jake.
Yes, definitely one of those we don't say. I'm Jake, work on CashApp. I work on libraries and tools that help our developers move as fast as possible, sort of the infrastructure side of the app. And thankfully that includes a lot of open source stuff, which is hopefully where you've gotten to know CashApp as well.
And I'm Jesse Wilson. I also work on CashApp in Kitchener-Waterloo. And I've been working on all parts of our CashApp stack, from the Android app lately to our Kotlin-based service backends. And currently I'm working on weird and ambitious multi-platform things.
We'll
Very
ask
cool.
you a little bit about that later.
We definitely will. First, though, I see everybody has different kinds of backgrounds, and that's been normal since everybody going remote. When you are working, what sort of development setup do you have? Do you still keep an old CRT around? Do you have a mechanical keyboard? Like, what makes you most productive in terms of your hardware setup?
Jake, is that you?
I guess. I've been remodeling my house for the better part of a year, so I have just been on a laptop roaming around my house. This is actually the first time I've had my monitor and my proper webcam connected. But yeah, normally it's just a simple external monitor, and I have a nice Logitech ergonomic, non-clickety-clackety keyboard. And that's it. I like to keep it simple.
I'm also a keep it simple person. I've got the my favorite piece of hardware is the Microsoft Sculpt keyboard. When I use the Mac keyboard, my wrists feel like they're doing this too much. And other than that, it's mostly trying to avoid the noise of my children and my dogs. So coming into the office is a nice perk.
Nice. And then when you code, do you listen to music? What music do you listen to, or do you listen to nothing, or is that too disruptive? Jesse, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's too embarrassing. I listen to like absolutely every genre of music. I used to be like I used to listen mostly to like rock music and alternative music that I thought was cool, but I've just recently started listening to a whole bunch of music that is not age appropriate for me. Like I was listening to Miley Cyrus yesterday, and a bunch of country music, a bunch of rock music, a bunch of heavy metal music, all the things. And usually I put the music on when I want to focus. And I find that it's a good way to sort of just block out the environment and allow me to really sort of just like devote my attention to one task.
Amazing. Jake?
Yeah, I kind of feel the same, although I'll throw in, again, going back to the having children, I find myself singing kids songs and stuff during the day while I'm working. But yeah, I've listened to music. It doesn't really matter what's on. A new album will come out from a band I like, and I'll be like, oh, I'll put this on while I'm working, and I'll listen to the album probably 6 times or 7 times on repeat and not remember listening to a single song on it. So I find that, yeah, it doesn't actually matter what I have on. It's mostly just the noise in the background that sort of desensitizes me to my environment and lets me focus. So I usually just hit play on something I like, and then sort of like the radio will take over, and it will just wind up in the weirdest places. But yeah, it ultimately doesn't really matter.
It's pretty funny, Jake. You're like, I'm listening to children's music, and Jesse's worried about Miley Cyrus not being age appropriate. I'm pretty sure she has a wide demographic. But and Jake's over here listening to the Wiggles.
Yep. It's funny because I try not to use Spotify for various reasons, but when I ultimately do, the like radio, because the kids used my account, the radio will inevitably take me back to kids' music because it thinks that's what I like, because that's what's listened to 90% of the time on my account.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Wharton listens to children's music most of the time.
That's the secret. It's the secret. I get very productive.
That's the secret to pure focus and open source magic is children's music.
Yep, you heard it here first.
I tend to be like a background snooper. Like I snoop on people's backgrounds. And if you look carefully in Justin's background, there's this book that I also have called Make Time. We're not endorsing it. We're just saying that it's there. And so we were wondering, it's a productivity book, and we were wondering if you have any productivity hacks that you want to share with us. We'll get to the multi-platform stuff now, but we were just wondering about productivity hacks, because I think it's something that a lot of people are curious about. They want to know, how do you guys like push so much code so frequently? There must be a secret. Jake, do you want to go first?
I don't think I have any revolutionary things. I have sort of like an anti-productivity hack that winds up increasing my productivity, which is I don't have any work email. I don't have Slack. I don't have anything from work on my phone. And so when I step away from my laptop, I have no ability to see or follow up on basically anything from work. Now I still can get to like our open source projects on GitHub and stuff if I absolutely need to. But one of the things that, you hear people occasionally have these anecdotes about is how you have a problem and you're stumped on it. And what you need to do is just like go take a walk or a drive or do something else. And so by not having those things on my phone, ultimately, like I'm not thinking about them consciously, but there's sort of like background threads in your brain that are running on the things you were doing that day. And by not being able to like quickly glance at email or quickly glance at Slack and let work things come to the forefront of my brain, the sort of work code things sit in the back of my brain. And ultimately, when I sit down either the next morning or maybe later that night, I'm in a place where like I will have thought of things without even realizing it and be able to sort of dive right in and start without a whole lot of ramp up time.
Going around the racetrack can jostle those things around too.
Yeah.
I think what Jake's telling us is that if we want to get more of his time and attention, we should just open source more of our internal things. And I think that's been a winning strategy.
Yes, please.
Yeah, not untrue.
Open a PR.
The productivity hack I have is I use Scratch files a lot. And I really like to use them as a planning vehicle. So I'll say, I've got this big, wide open problem. I don't understand anything about what I'm trying to do. And I'll just create a Scratch file and just sort of write the problem, write all the things I'm thinking about. And I also like to do this collaboratively. So I use a pairing app called Tuple. And it's really fun to just like find some random person on my team and say like, hey, let's use a Scratch file as a whiteboard. And I find it's like really good for turning abstract problems into possible solutions. And so I like that process, and I really like using like a Scratch file rather than using like a design doc as a thing. I think that whenever I'm in like design doc mode, I'm trying to like create a design that sounds like a heavyweight process and I'm trying to like impress somebody else. Whereas if I'm just like writing a bunch of notes to myself, I can really focus on the problem. And so that has really helped me solve bigger problems than I think I could do just by like trying or by following a formal process.
I think very critically, when you do those with pairing, you always make sure to share them in a place that they're not just like black holed on your computer. At the end, you sort of share them in a place that we can refer back to them somewhere.
Yeah.
Because we end up making a lot of decisions and stuff in those Scratch files.
Yeah, definitely.
The last sort of bonus question on this is like learning about new technologies and stuff. So how much time do you actually spend learning new tech? And like, for example, per week? And do you have any resources that you would recommend, like, for example, for mobile development? JC, you can start. You can.
So the tool I use here, I guess I use two of them. One is I use Twitter as a person who's like got an unhealthy addiction to it. And I use an app called Feedly, which is a fantastic RSS reader. And mostly what I try to do in both of these tools is just like understand what problems people are working on, what is making people grumpy. And I'm very rarely like reading tutorials or trying out new technologies. But what I like to do is have like a vague understanding of like what technologies are coming up, what technologies people are using that are established, and ultimately just have like a vague idea of what solutions exist out there in the world, so that if ever I come into a problem of that shape, I can go deeper into it. But I'm very rarely like exploring a technology just for the exploration's sake. And that might just be a function of the time constraints of that. Jake?
Yeah, I would retweet that if that was a tweet. I think I've said this a few times in the past for similar questions, but I find a lot of new ways of thinking in other technologies, and so I am by far no means an expert in a language like Swift or Rust or Go or whatever, but I've dabbled in those, and I think a lot of times when we ultimately give presentations or make new libraries, that we tend to draw an analogy to like some other library or framework that exists in some other space. And so, if you had been paying attention to things like the React and Vue and Svelte ecosystem in JavaScript, you've seen declarative UI coming, a decade away. Or you've paid attention to things like Rust and Swift, you've sort of seen the sort of limits of current compiler technology and how far we can push like static analysis and the type system. And so there's a lot of things that, and like Jesse, I don't sit down and do like a huge tutorial or anything. I may explore a little bit with code, but there's just not a lot of time for that. But yeah, like reading, following people on Twitter that are outside of my ecosystem in JavaScript, Rust, and Swift, and reading articles. I don't look at Hacker News at all, but I follow the top links that get posted to the top of Hacker News. That's through RSS. That's usually like a good way to see what technologies and stuff people are talking about without having to dive into the terribleness of that orange site. And you get exposed to those things, and then ultimately can bring them back. When something clicks, you can kind of bring that back into what you're currently working on in your ecosystem, and maybe make the state of the art of what we do on Android or in Kotlin a little bit better.
Amazing, thanks.
Yeah, so like if you've always been looking at these different technologies and stuff, how did you decide like mobile is where you want to get into? How did you get started with mobile?
So I got started in mobile a bit as an Android skeptic. I was working on ads at Google, and a friend of mine said, hey, come join the Android team. And this was 2008. And at the time, Android was like 5th place in a very tight race of different mobile platforms. It was Windows Mobile and BlackBerry and Palm OS, and the iPhone was coming, and then Android, which is this like committee of telecoms. And it was a really fun place to be. And it ends up that like a lot of Android success is not necessarily due to, and this may be blasphemous, but I think a lot of Android success isn't necessarily due to better technology or harder working or smarter design. I think it was a lot of like ecosystems and deals made at Google at strategic times in 2008, 2009. Like having exclusivity on Verizon right now seems like a really weird thing, but at the time, that turned out to be very relevant in getting Android phones in people's hands. And so being sort of at the right place at the right time is how I got into mobile. And it's been a really fun place to be. And it's sort of where I've defined my identity and where I've really tried to focus my career, mostly because I like the constrained problem of you're running code on a single device and you try to serve that user as best as possible, which is very different than the types of trade-offs you make on server, where it's all just like a soup of data and the user is very, very far away from what you're tending to be building?
Yeah, for me, it was a choice that wasn't really made for me. I had an iPhone at the time, but I couldn't build iPhone apps on a Linux laptop. And so the only thing I could build was either BlackBerry apps or Android apps. And when the very first, it was called the M3 SDK, the very first public Android SDK dropped, I saw you could build it from Linux, and I started, there was a competition where you could win a bunch of money, and I was determined to win all that money and never work in my life. Started building Android apps. I never submitted my entry into the contest, but the sort of the hooks were placed in me, and I didn't get an Android phone until probably 4-5 years after that. But in that span of time, I still worked on building Android apps because, you know, it was the only thing I could build on my laptop. And the idea of buying a Mac just to build and paying $99 a year as a college student, where $99 tends to go to, you know, alcoholic liquid instead of a certificate to sign some binary, the Android apps were just, you know, infinitely more accessible. And I think that was a huge win in driving adoption. And it certainly is what got me. And then eventually I did get an Android phone and I got to use what I built. But
yeah, so it took you a while to get an Android phone, and Jesse started as an Android skeptic. Do either of you enjoy coding iOS now? Do you like to throw it over the wall and let somebody else deal with it? How do you feel about iOS development now?
I mean, yeah, the thing we're working on now is really cool because we get to use Compose and target iOS apps. So that sort of makes it a lot more fun. And we're actually not the ones that tend to be writing the sort of the leaf-most code that runs on iOS and touches the UI. We sort of just write the common Jetpack Compose stuff. But yeah, it's really cool to see now the things that you work on run on multiple platforms.
I've become like really familiar with like all of the weaknesses and flaws and problems with the Android developer toolchain. So like I just understand how great it works and in all of its warts and all of its glory. And I similarly like know my way around IntelliJ, despite the fact that it's a big, complicated tool that is particularly in its like current incarnation. I know that there's new UIs and things to make it less scary, but it's a big airplane dashboard. And knowing all that stuff and just being really familiar with that, and then going to iOS development is really discomforting because it's a different set of flaws and limitations. And whether or not those flaws are like deeper or more severe or whatever, I get just like really presented with Xcode not working the way I expected to, Swift not working the way I expected to, and a lot of things that I'm familiar with from the Android ecosystem being missing means that iOS development is just really uncomfortable. That said, it's also like it's a really interesting place to learn.
Cool. So where did your journey with multi-platform start? I mean, can you tell us about your early days? I know Jake has a Kotlin Conf talk from 2018, so goes back yonders and yonks back. Jake, do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't actually know when our first, I don't know if we ever sat down with like a real intent to say like Kotlin multi-platform is the thing that we're going to build a multi-platform strategy on. A lot of it evolved organically over the life of, you know, like CashApp's needs. We recently gave a very abridged timeline of how we got to sort of our multi-platform story today in a DroidCon talk, where it actually started with sharing JavaScript across both our Android and iOS apps as a means of sharing, you know, logic and updating that logic faster than, you know, our App Store releases, which was also a critical thing. And then Kotlin Multiplatform evolved after we were doing that. And, you know, we already were using Kotlin in our Android app. And so it became a very appealing target to share code that still was logic that we wanted shared, but, you know, didn't have that requirement where we needed to update it outside the normal App Store releases. And so I wasn't at I left to go to a big scary company for a couple of years and wasn't at Cash when the first multi-platform code rolled out. But it started with a lot of small, just simple logic modules. And then a really aggressive thing that we were working on at the time was to get SQLite, the database querying library that we use, to be multi-platform, because SQLite itself is a multi-platform C library. And so the thing we built on top of that in Kotlin could also be multi-platform and just talk to SQLite on each one of those targets. And so that was sort of the larger and very public effort, but it actually took a lot longer to get into the app than just some of the simple, pure logic-based code that was being shared. And I think it was kind of a timing thing as well. If Swift had come out and somehow done something magical where they targeted Kotlin or JVM bytecode and JavaScript, we may not be doing this podcast, and our iOS counterparts would be talking to their, somebody at whatever developer relations people work on iOS about how Swift has enabled us to do all this. So it really was like a combination of our existing needs and the existing language that we're already using, and sort of just the right place at the right time.
One other thing I think that's like really urgent in our organization is just the number of different client applications we support at a time is a lot. We have 2 platforms, and then each of them we support. Typically, we don't force users to upgrade for a year. Not exactly, not firm, but that's typically how long we keep each app update live before we force users to upgrade. And that means that there's just a lot of burden, both on servers to try and keep all of those different variations all working simultaneously, and then also on clients to be able to anticipate what the app is going to need to do next year. And so reducing the number of dimensions that we're supporting means that multi-platform is a really compelling thing that we want. And technology-wise, it's a very conservative choice, just because we can continue to build our existing application and leverage all the existing investments we've made. So I think that that's really what brings us to Kotlin Multiplatform.
Yeah, the platforms keep changing, and having one place to share at least some of it, and be flexible about what you're sharing so you can leverage them the best that you can, makes a lot of sense. And that's why we're at TouchLab, we're into Kotlin Multiplatform. As the landscape changes with the platforms and with Kotlin Multiplatform being beta now, what resources do you find, and I'll ask Jake specifically on this one, what resources do you find yourself coming back to stay on top of things and to also know what's possible?
It's tough. I think Kotlin, in terms of popularity, really exploded the last, maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, the Android inflection of, that becoming supported was huge. But you can really see on the Kotlin Lang Slack and stuff that just the sheer number of people interested in doing stuff. And then the fact that it's now multi-platform means you get, interest from people wanting to target iOS and JavaScript. And it actually is a little overwhelming as to the number of things that are going on. I definitely have a hard time staying on top of a lot of things. I fall back to, I think Slack is a really horrific tool. I don't think it's a good way to learn about stuff like this. I tend to fall back on things that I can parse, asynchronously at my own pace. So it goes back to the following people on Twitter, the reading stuff in Feedly, RSS feeds. But then, there's the various weekly roundups of links and stuff that go out, whether it's Android specific, Kotlin specific, multi-platform specific, whatever. I don't follow those too closly, but I still get them, and I will occasionally look at them and click through, because that's a great way to just find blog posts and libraries from outside of the immediate sort of followers and things that I follow. because otherwise it's, I'm just relying on sort of word of mouth and my own sort of circle of people, and you tend to miss out on, there's a whole like, the Asian Pacific region has a ton of people working on this stuff and doing libraries that we don't really talk about in sort of the Western, world, and those go unnoticed. And I sort of rely on these things that pop me out of my my immediate, bubble to discover them.
I had one more resource that I really like, which is reading the talks at various DroidCons and other tech conferences. I find that like going through those and seeing like, oh, this is what different companies are using, and like often it's nice to see what my peers are doing at other organizations to understand effectively like how aggressive we're being with adopting technology and what we might be missing.
Yeah. So what advice would you give, Jesse? What advice would you give mobile developers that want to start their multi-platform mobile journey, but they're kind of hesitant, they don't know where to start? What advice would you give them?
I think there's like, I don't know if this is Kevin Galligan's advice from TouchLab or general advice, but I think that the really conservative recipe of adopting Kotlin Multiplatform today is find some discrete piece of business logic in your application that's inside your Android application, extract it into a module, and build it as a binary for Swift that you can use as a library, something really headless, is a really nice way to force through all of the different integrations that you need to do in terms of like, okay, so we have code in this repo and it needs to end up in this binary in a different repo. And like that process is hard and annoying. But once you get that system working end to end, then you can start to build more and more stuff into your multi-platform library. And so at CashApp, we have a GitHub repo called Cash Mobile Multiplatform. And the idea of this thing is everything that we publish here gets built by CI to our Artifactory service internally. And then I think, I don't even remember how like the CocoaPods thing shows up, but it goes from there into our iOS repo and from there into our Android repo. And so having that as a pipeline just works. And like literally the logic that we started out with is incredibly simple. We say, what do we do to take a customer ID and map it to a color so that if we pick random colors for people's avatar icons, they're consistent from launch to launch, and then also from platform to platform, so that if you're using CashApp on the web or an Android or an iOS, Jake will always be like a nice color of teal or something.
Yeah, the nice thing about having it bottom out in CocoaPods and publishing that somewhere is it's the same mechanism that your iOS developers are already using to consume a bunch of libraries. And if your API surface is small enough, just like that pure function from the customer token to the color, it's going to show up in Objective-C or Swift as the same exact API they otherwise would have written, and they may not even know that you've now replaced that with a Kotlin compiled to Kotlin native function.
So Justin mentioned earlier that we went to beta yesterday. Well, at the time of recording, it was yesterday. So what do you think? What does that mean for you? What does it mean for the community? What are your thoughts on that? Do you want to start with Jake?
Yeah, for us, that was just Monday. I mean, we are headfirst into this ecosystem, and so it doesn't really change anything day to day for us. We're already involved, probably to the most degree that we can be. And we're certainly, in terms though of, what it means to the community, stuff like that helps ensure that the longevity of the project, is hopefully going to be something that's stable and available for us to use. And it also means that, there are organizations that are more conservative. It's usually not you, it's usually the person above you that's making the decisions, that needs to see that label of beta or potentially even needs to wait until it says it's absolutely stable. And so enabling, if that means that it enables more organizations and more developers to start adopting it, and then to start building those libraries and to start giving those talks and to start trying out new things, it's just going to wind up benefiting everyone. And so that I think is the most important reason to move it forward in its progression. But yeah, like ultimately for us, we're already so invested that like we want to we're doing everything in our power to make it successful. And so the only thing that we can't do is do things like ensure that it's going to be stable long term. That's only something that really JetBrains itself can do. And so yeah, seeing that it's going to be a big win for hopefully the adoption. Goes back to what I said about how like when Android said Kotlin is now a first class thing, it really rocketed up. It changed the slope on the graph of adoption, and hopefully this will do the same for multi-platform.
Oh, one other announcement that came out yesterday was there's some Jetpack Compose library, or sorry, some Jetpack libraries, not Jetpack Compose, Jetpack libraries that are going into experimental for multi-platform. And this is amazing for us because we are trying to figure out how we can do more and more things in multi-platform. And so having the ability to use Jetpack libraries from our shared code base is a big benefit. Naturally, these libraries are currently experimental, and so we're not able to ship them into production at all, but we can experiment with them and see and maybe help provide feedback on them and guide them to a place that will fit us very well when they're further along in their journey.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was looking at the beta announcement and I saw like, it's beta and stability is coming in 2023, and I saw TouchLab is coming out with KMM Bridge for iOS deployment. And then there was that Google one. When I looked into it, I saw OKIO in there, and you're one of you are the top contributor to that, Jesse, right? How does that feel? How did that work to getting in there?
It's okay. I think that OKIO is a really I'm very happy to have it, and I think that I'd say very proud of a lot of the work that we've done with it. I think that one of the things that's difficult is it's a bit upside down in terms of this is a third-party library that ends up being used as a leverage point in terms of first-party things. But I think that it does a good job of the scope that we've done for it, and I'm sort of like optimistic that we can keep it simple and also serve the needs of most of the people. Like one of the things that's nice about OKIO is I get to say, we're not going to solve that problem because it's hard, and that problem just makes the whole project big and complicated. And as we get more users, there's a lot more pressure to introduce features that both solve real problems and also significantly increase the complexity of the library. So, for example, doing file system permissions is just a big, complicated beast. And so far in OKIO, we've just been able to say, if you want that, go use something else, although there is no something else. And that pressure may now come, and we'll have to figure out there's some more decisions to make, I guess, going forward.
So what would you like to see next? Well, obviously next is stable, and we are hoping for 2023, right? But what would you like to see happen so that we can go to stable? What would you like to see in the stable release? Let's start with Jake.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what we really. I think everything I need in terms of pain points that both we experience and others experience tend to be outside the sort of narrow lens of the Kotlin multi-platform mobile effort. I think a lot of focus is being done on like the K2 compiler, and like the biggest one for me in terms of just like minimizing the pain that people experience is the stabilization of compiler plugin APIs. And so as these tools like Kotlin multi-platform mobile become stable and bring on more people, you're going to see more usage of other libraries and tools in the ecosystem. And so stuff like that, the stability of compiler plugins is one that really holds us back and causes us not to be able to upgrade as fast as we would like to. And so, it's not specifically in, the space of what you're saying of what we need to get stable. But it's certainly one that's very, very closely related. Because once you, especially with, I don't know how much we all are allowed to talk about this, but there is forthcoming support for Kotlin native in JetBrains Compose, which is, relies on the Kotlin compiler plugin API. And so it works if you build it yourself, but as these things get more and more adoption and people want to use those tools to target UI to multiple platforms, the need to keep 5 to 10 different versions of libraries in lockstep sync and knowing which versions are the ones you need to use, definitely, it's a pain for us, and I'm sure it trips up quite a lot of people that are just exploring this for the first time or just getting into it. And so I know there's a lot of work, and that is a lot of work, and it's being done to push that forward. But that's definitely a huge one that I think will remove quite a bit of paper cuts around using these tools.
If anyone can do it, JetBrains can. I remember when JetBrains said, we're going to be moving the memory model from this thing with all the freezing to what everybody wants. And we're going to do that soon. It's like maybe 5 years. And then it was like 2 years. And they because they focused on it, and they're like, this is important to the community. This is important to the future of Kotlin Multiplatform. And like you said, compiler plugins, they're powerful. They're hard to use right now. But I also see them as the future, like where this is going to go. It just opens up so many doors.
There already has been huge, Herculean, like the IR stuff didn't even exist when we had just the JVM and JS backends. They were separate backends that compiled from, from just parsing the source or whatever. And Kotlin native is what brought the IR. And then the entire, we kind of forget the entire JVM backend was rewritten to be IR. The entire JavaScript backend was rewritten, and hopefully we'll be stabilizing that soon. And so, yeah, they have already done these Herculean efforts to, move the compiler ecosystem and the ability to even write compiler plugins forward. And so I have no doubt it'll get done. And they certainly have shown their ability to pull off these absolutely massive projects. And so it is just a matter of time. And so that's something I'm definitely looking forward to.
I think they've also done a good job of threading the needle between giving us something that's unstable that we can use and kick the tires with, and then eventually getting to that stable point. Like the fact that Compose is built on this unstable thing means that Compose exists, and we're all very grateful for that. One thing I would add is that, like, when I go to maintain OKIO, it's a really difficult project to maintain because of a lot of the small limitations of multi-platform. So, for example, we have lots of different methods or lots of different functions that we need to trampoline around to support common implementations inside classes that don't all have expect and actual functions. And so if you just look at OKIO, the project structure is not what you'd sort of naturally expect it to be. There's a lot of helper classes and functions that redirect to other functions, and classes that are copy pasted into each of the various platforms. And that's a limitation that completely makes sense. But I think that it's a big opportunity where the easier it is and the lower friction it is to write code that mixes the platforms together, I think that the more adoption, at least I would be interested in performing.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to take all this stuff back and send it to my team. They're going to be excited. We're going to have a little party. It's going to be amazing.
When I think of making it easier to write for the other platforms, some approaches will say well, let's just forget about the other platforms and we'll give you some abstraction in a new language, another way, just worry about this framework and it'll work magically on all the other platforms. And Kotlin Multiplatform does not do that. So you do need to know something about the other platforms. Is for Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile, you need to know something about iOS or something about Swift. Like, what do you still feel like you need to learn? And when you were getting started, what did you learn that was like, I can make better Kotlin multi-platform code now that I understand the iOS and Swift side?
I mean, I still struggle quite a bit with it's basically you get spoiled by just having a garbage collector that really kicks ass, and not really having to care about the lifetime of objects. Just that you sort of know they're not leaking, but you've never really defined the lifetime of that object. Obviously you knew it up, but it might be passed through a couple functions, and then its enclosing object is not referenced anymore, and that other object will just be freed along with the one that wraps it or whatever. And when you're doing Kotlin native, and especially Kotlin native that has to bridge out to a C API, which you very quickly will run into if you're calling either platform APIs or potentially interfacing with a library, that you really need to be aware of the lifetime of these objects and whose responsibility it is to get rid of them when they're done. And it definitely it's one of those things that when I talked about earlier about other languages, like you think a lot about that when you write Rust code, and then I can take that back to when I'm writing Kotlin and try and structure my functions and my classes so that they have sort of well-defined lifetimes that you can reason about, rather than things just sort of being not a mess, but sort of opaque, where it's not really clear the lifetime of things or who owns something. It's something that Kotlin native also forces you into. And when you write that way, you tend to just write code that's easier to reason about, easier to test, and ultimately is better on every platform. But because that version of the language forces you into it, it's something that now you have to do consciously. Whereas when you're just targeting the JVM, it's not really something that you tend to think about unless you run into a memory leak.
Yeah, one example of like where this exact thing becomes difficult is trying to take APIs written for Java or written for the JVM and trying to take them and make them work multi-platform, because there just may be more management involved to do it in a way that works in Kotlin native. One other example is anything that touches Kotlin JS can't be blocking. And so it's just really hard to take APIs written for one paradigm and make them work in another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you try to make things easier for the iOS consumers, like the developers on iOS who need to work with the APIs that are coming out of these frameworks?
I think we definitely tend to limit ourselves in, we don't write the most, we don't write Kotlin that uses like the most language features possible at the bridge. Just a really simple example is you don't have abstract, or you don't have default implementations of functions either in interfaces or abstract classes when that gets exposed to through the Objective-C bridge. And so if we need something from that host platform, we tend to just give them a pure interface with just functions that they implement. Whereas if we were just writing, pure Kotlin for Kotlin JVM, you might have like default implementations of a function that you can, derive from other functions on the interface, and you might use properties. You might use generics. These things tend to just not work well because it is an entirely separate language with its own limitations and features that you're not going to be able to map 100% into. And that's also true on the JVM as well. Sometimes your Kotlin code that you write looks a little weird on the Java side, and you can try and massage it, but it may not always be 100% perfect. And so limiting yourself to just really straightforward, parameters in, parameters out, and like interfaces without default implementations tends to make the iOS engineers or the person consuming it from Kotlin native, it tends to make their lives easier. Because then when you write the function, when you write the interface that has a default implementation of the function that you maybe only override once, if you do that and expose that to iOS, they have to write that every single time, so it becomes, you don't want them to feel burdened by the code that you're exposing. You want them to feel enabled because they have all this power of the shared code. You don't want them calling your code to feel like it's a chore or that it's not providing the amount of benefit compared to the amount of boilerplate or ceremony or whatever that they have to write. And so we find that if you tend to limit yourself to very simple, straightforward sort of APIs, because it is a boundary, that you wind up with a better experience from the host platform. And that tends to be true both for JavaScript and JVM as well as with native.
That's really good advice.
I think one other thing that's really relevant there is that like the boundary itself is something we need to design with when you're building like a library in Kotlin for consumption by Android. You can build something that's like a toolbox that just says like, here's all the pieces, assemble them however you like. And that approach works great when it's Kotlin all the way through. When it's Kotlin native exporting to Swift, actually thinking about what is in Kotlin, what parts of this is somebody going to write in Kotlin and what parts of it are they going to write in Swift, changes how you define the API altogether.
Absolutely. Yeah. Keeping it simple, keeping it just matter of fact. Yeah. Amazing. Thanks. I'm curious about, so for example, if somebody comes to you and they wanted to know, you have this experience with multi-platform mobile, but how would you encourage them? They're a little hesitant, they're curious, hesitant, skeptical, all a mixture of emotions together. How would you convince them to give it a try? Maybe let's start with Jesse, or just
sure.
Jesse.
I think that like appealing to just other raw emotions is a good strategy. It's like, oh, did you know that like the people at this other organization are writing half as much code as you, or maybe 10% less code, or so whatever. Like this module is duplicated in two places, and we have to have a process to keep the iOS developer and the Android developer in sync. And that process is annoying, and it causes us to have bugs. And so maybe you get not like the ambition to use Kotlin Multiplatform or the fun exploration of it, but rather maybe view it as like the jealousy of having a process that's faster, or perhaps like the fear of letting these two things get out of sync. I think there's like a ton of raw emotions here, and I think that like the case for multi-platform is about replacing processes to keep different teams in sync, and replacing processes to make sure it's like, well, how do we keep these two teams with the same number of people on them? There's like a whole bunch of bureaucracy there. And if you just say, well, we can solve this problem with technology, I think that is a very compelling play. Jake, what I miss?
I think if you take the strategy we talked about earlier, which is sort of starting these very logic-driven, pure, modules that you can pull out, the failure mode, not that we want there to be a failure mode, but like if your endeavor to do Kotlin multi-platform fails, the amount of effort that you've done on your side is your side being the Android side or the JVM side. The amount of effort that you've done is very little because you're already writing Kotlin code, and then adapting it to be multi-platform, especially if it's a very logic-heavy set of code, should be relatively minimal. And then like it's still just Kotlin code that can run in your app if the project doesn't, if for whatever reason the effort doesn't work and your iOS developers don't want to do this. But if they do, you've done a minimal amount of work, and you get what Jesse said, which was now they don't really have to do any work other than that glue code at the integration point. And suddenly all of that duplicated logic for which you may have to have maintained a process or done code generation or done some other mechanism to keep in sync, it goes away because you now have a single point of truth to your code, rather than having the single point of truth be some sort of process that has human involvement and interpretation that can skew the actual implementation on multiple platforms. And so if you're starting from a place where you have existing Android or JVM code, it's a very low effort change to make it multi-platform ready. And then you can start experimenting with whether it's something that you want to integrate or not, without really affecting your own build or your own code base that much.
I like that thinking. That's cool.
Yeah, and the product managers don't need to think about it as much. They're like, why is the tax calculation on Android different than on iOS?
That's true.
Or the email validation.
Yeah. All these things.
Yeah, those two examples are like the precise examples the precise modules that we have like in our shared multi-platform repo. It's like money formatting, tax calculation is a perfect example. All of those things that are very inputs in, inputs out, just kind of thing that you contains a lot of business logic, but it's just literally if else kind of stuff, is a fantastic candidate for making multi-platform.
Something else that I think encourages people to get into is when they see that there's so much involvement. I know like Square's been building libraries for a while. One of you mentioned SQLite early on, moving into multi-platform, allowing a persistence layer. There's people who are building logging and crash reporting and a lot of other things and now there's competing implementations because the community is growing and they're trying to solve it in the best way that they see. What sort of multi-platform libraries do you see yourself coming back to all the time? And which are the ones you like, anything in the community you want to give a special shout out to?
I tend to use, for the same reason where we talk about, business logic being something you want to share, serialization models that you're sending over the wire. And so one of the cool things about Kotlin Multiplatform is you can write the front end and the back end of an application in the same repo, whether that's a JVM server and an Android app, or Node server and a JavaScript app, or some combination of those. I tend to do JVM servers and like a JavaScript front end for a lot of toy projects. And instead of normally or like historically, we would have to have implementations like Pojos or whatever on both sides and keep them in sync. Back at the whole maintaining a process thing, we would have to have a process to keep those models in sync. And with something like Kotlin serialization, you can just have a data class be in your common source set and have them shared across both JVM and JavaScript and serialize using the same serialization format, whether it's JSON or whichever one you would like to use. Mm-hmm. And that whole problem just goes away. And I feel like the client server thing is just a recurring pattern that you see. I mean, another example that we used a couple of years ago was the Android app was the server, and it was for a cast application to the TV, which is a JavaScript, front end. And it's like suddenly your Android app and has Kotlin code and just JavaScript running, and the cast device has JavaScript code, and you need them to talk to each other. And Kotlin serialization lets you serialize models and create a very simple RPC sort of communication pipeline between them. And I think that's one that is just deeply foundational, because ultimately, an app that doesn't talk to anything else is probably just a calculator. I don't, there's not a whole lot of functionality you can do without interfacing with some other aspect of a larger system. And serialization is at the heart of that.
Yeah, I'd also just call it like SQLite is one of my absolute favorite libraries. I love how it's both a library and also an IDE plugin, and having it as a multi-platform asset is like a really big boost that we're eager to put to more use in CashApp.
What do you think is still missing from the ecosystem?
So I mean, the big one is pixels. A multi-platform canvas or a multi-platform compose, or and I think there's like lots of different efforts in this space. We've got a project that does it differently, where we're working on using native components everywhere. But I think that's a really that's a really strategic one, and also one that's going to be very difficult to do just right. And then I don't know. I like the difficulty is figuring out how to make it so that your iOS application feels like an iOS application and not a multi-platform application. And so I'm a little bit reluctant to say that like Kotlin Multiplatform should aspire to be a write once, run anywhere solution. And so I think that most of the things that I want it to support are all sort of backhouse, local persistence, local networking, local persistence, networking, and all the sort of just business logic things.
The invisible stuff. Yeah.
I don't know if it's just because I've been in the industry so long, but when I use an Android app, I can tell it was written by iOS developers, or at least designed by an iOS designer. And same with iOS. I don't have an iOS phone, I haven't, but when I see screenshots, I'm like, why does this look like Android? It doesn't look like iOS. I love how you're bringing that up, and that is an issue to deal with. In DroidCon, you were talking about some kind of technologies you were working on at Cache, Zipline, Redwood, merging this like, hey, we want to develop UIs for both. We want to be able to update them as we need to and not deal with the stores. Like, tell us more about this innovation that you're working on.
Jake, do you want to start?
I'll do the Redwood part of it, and you could do the Zipline part of it.
Sneaky.
As we do.
As we've done. Yeah, I think the core principle of Redwood is we think the native UI toolkit on every platform is the right toolkit to use. But again, it goes back to the logic that sits immediately behind those screens tends to be exactly the same on each platform. And we write it twice, and both are susceptible to bugs. And the idea that we can deduplicate the presenter that sits behind a screen, but still leverage the native UI toolkit on each platform, it is what we're exploring. And so we use Jetpack Compose. It can be compiled natively. So you can compile it to bytecode to run on Android, or to Kotlin native to run on iOS. And then instead of targeting a UI toolkit directly, you target what is basically your design system that you define. And so you might define, your our previous design, our existing design system is called Mooncake. So we may have like a Mooncake button, and it, instead of giving you 100 knobs to customize it, it just has primary, secondary, and tertiary as style options. And so you don't get to customize the border radius and all that stuff. And then at the presenter level, once you've done your actual like logic, you then create a representation of the screen in your design system. So it might be a column with some text and your Mooncake button, and you bind the UI to that. And then on the actual host, we bind that to your Mooncake button view or whatever, or your UI kit Mooncake button on each platform. And so that was the idea behind Redwood, was to not abandon our native engineers and our native UI toolkit, but to just share the logic that lives behind the screens, so that we can minimize bugs and all that stuff. And then Zipline is the second part of it that Jesse can explain, which makes it even more powerful.
So if you're like running Google Maps in your browser, or if you're running Gmail in your browser, you're not wondering what version you're running. You're always running the current version. And in mobile apps, no matter what, no matter how frequently you deploy, you're always running a version that's old. And this is more of a problem for applications that have sort of like the big ambitious problem space of finance or any sort of like unicorn style organization where you want to do a lot of experiments, try a lot of things, and build a lot of complexity in your application. And so what we have encountered is just a lot of difficulty being incremental at something that's just become very, very big. And so our idea with Zipline is we use Kotlin Multiplatform to not build JVM or native, but to actually compile it to something we can download at runtime. So right now that's Kotlin.js. At some point that may later be Kotlin with WebAssembly. And the idea is we ship bytecode to the device every time you launch it, and it works like a web application where you're always up to date. And the thing that's really nice about that is when you're building features, you're not saying, what are all the different feature flags and knobs and configuration I'm going to need in order to respond to things that may change in the business next month? Instead, you say, we'll ship whatever we need for today. And if we want to change it for next month, we'll just ship it again. And to me, this is like a really ambitious and exciting project. We're starting out relatively conservatively with just a few different places in our app. But I'm hoping that the gains in us not having to try and predict the future will end up making this technology really shine.
Nice. So we're going to sort of start rounding off the podcast with a couple of questions about just some follow-up stuff, like what multi-platform goodies you're working on at the moment, any sneak peeks, hints, anything that you're working on, Jake?
I mean, Redwood and Zipline are our core focus. I think we have two interesting things that other members on our team are working at to help us along, which is that other members on our team are building a multi-platform Flexbox implementation, or rather we're porting a Flexbox implementation to be pure Kotlin multi-platform. So this is just the engine that performs the logic. And then you could use that to bind it to either native UI or in Jetpack Compose UI, or it's multi-platform, so UI kit, or I don't know why you would run it in JavaScript, but you could run it in JavaScript. This is something that's going to be shipped in Redwood, but it's available. It'll be a standalone thing that you could use if you wanted to use it. And then also as part of Redwood, we're going to be shipping a multi-platform paging library integration. So the paging thing, again, will be totally separate, that you could use multi-platform if you want. And then on Redwood, it will allow us to have a multi-platform lazy column, basically. So those are interesting efforts that are driven by Redwood, but not specifically only available to use from Redwood, where we tend to intentionally make things separate by, like with good layering. And so this is the same thing where the Flexbox engine and the multi-platform paging are completely standalone, and you can use them. You'll be able to use them for, other purposes if you want. And then we'll, have integration modules in Redwood if you happen to be using Redwood.
So since you two are such a dream team about, doing talks and stuff together, where can we catch your next talk?
I don't know. It'll probably be a year, because Jesse and I both, well, not us, but our significant others are both about to bring fresh life into the world. And so I think we'll be taking some time away from giving talks.
Congratulations to you both.
Thanks. Jesse's is super soon. This is probably the last time you'll see him for a year.
Glad we got you here.
Yeah, thank
next
you
week.
So much. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you both. It was really insightful, not just to being able to talk about the beta announcement that, as of this recording, just happened yesterday, but that you have already been putting Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile into production in Cache, and you're working on this new experimental stuff, Redwood, and you're putting that into production. The fact that your tips on the community involvement, how to get involved, how to not be like too intimidated and just get started. It's really powerful for everybody to hear. Thank you so much. And thank you, Pamela, for joining me as co-host. We're going to see you again. We're going to see everybody that's watching. Hopefully we can get some of you on the show next.
Cool. Thank you,
Thanks for having
everyone.
us.
Thank you.